History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3, The Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 9, The Elements of a Future. Justinian was almost always at war. Often he was victorious. Even the costly Persian campaigns and payments to the Persian king were successful in the limited sense that they did not lose the empire much ground. Yet they were a grave strategic handicap, the liberation of his resources for a policy of recovery in the West, which had been Justinian's aim in his first peace with the Persians, always eluded him. Nevertheless, his greatest general, Belisarius, destroyed Vandal Africa and recovered that country for the empire, though it took 10 years to reduce it to order. He went on to invade Italy and began the struggle which ended in 554 with the final eviction of the Ostrogoths from Rome and the unification once more of all Italy under imperial rule, albeit an Italy devastated by the imperial armies as it had never been by the barbarians. These were great achievements, though badly followed up. More were to follow in southern Spain, where the imperial armies exploited rivalry between Visigoths and again set up imperial government in Cordoba. Throughout the western Mediterranean, too, the imperial fleets were supreme. For a century after Justinian's death, Byzantine ships moved about unmolested. It did not last. By the end of the century, most of Italy was gone again, this time to the Lombards, another Germanic people, and the final extinguishers of imperial power in the peninsula. In Eastern Europe, too, in spite of a vigorous diplomacy of bribery and missionary ideology, Justinian had never been successful in dealing with the barbarians. Perhaps enduring success there was impossible. The pressure from behind on these migrant people was too great, and besides, this could see great prizes ahead. The barbarians, wrote one historian of the reign, having once tasted Roman wealth, never forgot the road that led to it. By Justinian's death, in spite of his expensive fortress building, the ancestors of the later Bulgars were settled in Thrace, and a wedge of barbarian peoples separated West and East Rome. Justinian conquests, great as they were, could not be maintained by his successors in the face of the continuing threat from Persia. The rise of Slav pressure in the Balkans and in the 7th century of a new rival, Islam. A terrible time lay ahead. Yet, even then, Justinian's legacy would be operative through the diplomatic tradition he founded, the building of a network of influences among the barbarian peoples beyond the frontier, playing off one against another, bribing one prince with tribute or a title, standing godparent to the baptized children of another. If it had not been for the client princedoms of the Caucasus who were converted to Christianity in Justinian's day, or his alliance with the Crimean Goths, which was to last 7 centuries, the survival of the Eastern Empire would have been almost impossible. In this sense, too, the reign sets out the ground plan of a future Byzantine sphere. With the empire, Justinian left an indelible imprint. At his accession, the monarchy was handicapped by the persistence of a party rivalry, which could draw upon popular support. But in 532, this led to a great insurrection which made it possible to strike at the factions, and though much of the city was burned, this was the end of domestic threats to Justinian's autocracy. It showed itself henceforth more and more consistently and nakedly. Its material monuments were lavish. The greatest is the Basilica of Saint Sophia itself, 532 to 537. But all over the empire, public buildings, churches, baths, and new towns mark the reign and speak for the inherent wealth of the Eastern Empire. The richest and most civilized provinces were in Asia and Egypt. Alexandria, Antioch, and Beirut were their great cities. A non material, institutional monument of the reign was Justinian's codification of Roman law. In four collections, 1,000 years of Roman jurisprudence was put together in a form which gave it deep influence across the centuries and helped to shape the modern idea of the state. Justinian's efforts to win administrative and organizational reform were far less successful. It was not difficult to diagnose ills known to be dangerous as long before as the 3rd century. But given the expense and responsibilities of the empire, permanent remedies were hard to find. The sale of offices, for example, was known to be an evil, and Justinian abolished it, but then had to tolerate it when it crept back. The main institutional response to the empire's problem was a progressive regimental of its citizens. In part, this was in the tradition of regulating the economy which he had inherited. Just as peasants were tied to the soil, craftsmen were now attached to their hereditary corporations and guilds. Even the bureaucracy tended to become hereditary. The resulting rigidity was unlikely to make imperial problems easier to solve. It was unfortunate, too, that a quite exceptionally disastrous series of natural calamities fell on the East at the beginning of the 6th century. They go far to explain why it was hard for Justinian to leave the empire in better fettle than he found it. Earthquake, famine, plague devastated the cities and even the capital itself, where men saw phantoms in the streets. The ancient world was a credulous place, but tales of the emperor's capacity to take off his head and then put it on again, or to disappear from sight at will, suggest that under these strains, the mental world of the Eastern Empire was already slipping its moorings in classical civilization. Justinian was to make the separation easier by his religious outlook and policies. Another paradoxical outcome, for it was far from what he had intended. After it had survived for 800 years, he abolished the Academy of Athens. He wanted to be a Christian emperor, not a ruler of unbelievers, and decreed the destruction of all pagan statues in the capital. Worse still, he accelerated the demotion of the Jews in civic status and the reduction of their freedom to exercise their religion. Things had already gone a long way by then. Pogroms had long been connived at and synagogues destroyed. Now Justinian went on to alter the Jewish calendar and interfere with the Jewish order of worship. He even encouraged barbarian rulers to persecute Jews. Long before the cities of Western Europe, Constantinople had a ghetto. Justinian was all the more confident of the rightness of asserting imperial authority in ecclesiastical affairs because, like the later James I of England, he had a real taste for theological disputation. Sometimes the consequences were unfortunate. Such an attitude did nothing to renew the loyalty to the empire of the Nestorians and Monophysites, heretics who had refused to accept the definitions of the precise relationship of God the Father to God the Son, laid down in 451 at a council at Chalcedon. The theology of such deviants mattered less than the fact that their symbolic tenets were increasingly identified with important linguistic and cultural groups. The empire began to create its ulsters. Harrying heretics intensified separatist feeling in parts of Egypt and Syria. In the former, the Coptic Church went its own way in opposition to orthodoxy in the later 5th century, and the Syrian Monophysites followed, setting up a Jacobite church. Both were encouraged and sustained by the numerous and enthusiastic monks of those countries. Some of these sects and communities, too, had important connections outside the empire, so that foreign policy was involved. The Nestorians found refuge in Persia, and though not heretics, the Jews were especially influential beyond the frontiers. Jews in Iraq supported Persian attacks on the empire, and Jewish Arab states in the Red Sea interfered with the trade routes to India when hostile measures were taken against Jews in the empire. Justinian's hopes of reuniting the Western and Eastern churches were to be thwarted in spite of his zeal. A potential division between them had always existed because of the different cultural matrices in which each had been formed. The Western Church had never accepted the union of religious and secular authority, which was the heart of the political theory of the Eastern Empire. The empire would pass away as others had done, and the Bible told, and it would be the church which would prevail against the gates of hell. Now, such doctrinal divergences became more important, and separation had been made more likely by the breakdown in the West. A Roman pope visited Justinian, and the emperor spoke of Rome as a source of priesthood, but in the end, two Christian communions were first to go their own ways, and then violently to quarrel. Justinian's own view that the emperor was supreme, even on matters of doctrine, fell victim to clerical intransigence on both sides. This seems to imply, as do so many others of his acts, that Justinian's real achievement was not that which he sought and temporarily achieved, and the re establishment of the imperial unity, but a quite different one, the easing of the path towards the development of a new Byzantine civilization. After him, it was a reality, even if not yet recognized. Byzantium was evolving away from the classical world towards a style clearly related to it but independent of it. This was made easier by contemporary developments in both Eastern and Western culture, by now overwhelmingly a matter of new tendencies in the Church. As often in later history, the Church and its leaders had not at first recognized or welcomed an opportunity in disaster. They identified themselves with what was collapsing, and understandably so. The collapse of the empire was for them the collapse of civilization. The church in the West was, except for municipal authority in the impoverished towns, often the sole institutional survivor of Romanitas. Its bishops were men with experience of administration, at least as likely as other local notables to be intellectually equipped to grapple with new problems. A semi pagan population looked to them with superstitious awe and attributed to them near magical powers. In many places, they were the last embodiment of authority left when imperial armies went away and imperial administration crumbled, and they were lettered men among a new unlettered ruling class which craved the assurance of sharing the classical heritage. Socially, they were often drawn from the leading provincial families. That meant that they were sometimes great aristocrats and proprietors with material resources to support their spiritual role. Naturally, new tasks were thrust upon them. This was not all. The end of the classical world also saw two new institutions emerge in the Western Church, which were to be lifelines in the dangerous rapids between a civilization which had collapsed and one yet to be born. The first was Christian monasticism, a phenomenon first appearing in the East. It was about 285 that a Copt, Saint Anthony, retired to a hermit's life in the Egyptian desert. His example was followed by others who watched, prayed, and strove with demons or mortified the flesh by fasting and more dubious disciplines. Some of them drew all together in communities. In the next century, this new form of spirituality established itself in a communal form in the Levant and Syria. From there, the idea spread to the west, to the Mediterranean coast of France, in a crumbling society such as 5th century Gaul. The monoastic ideal of undistracted worship and service to God in prayer within the discipline of an ascetic rule was attractive to many men and women of intellect and character, though if they could assure personal salvation. The communities attracted many from among the well born who sought a refuge from the changing world. Unfriendly critics who hankered after the old Roman ideal of service to the state condemned them for shrinking their proper responsibilities to society by withdrawing from it. Nor did churchmen always welcome what they saw as the desertion of some of the most zealous among their congregations. Yet many of the greatest churchmen of the age were monks, and the institution prospered. Landowners founded communities or endowed existing ones with lands. There were some scandals and no doubt many compromises of principle in grappling with patrons and men of power. One Italian monk, of whom we know little except his achievement and that he was believed to work miracles, found the state of monasticism shocking. This was Saint Benedict, one of the most influential men in the church's history. In 529, he set up a monastery at Monte Cassino in southern Italy, giving it a new rule which he had compiled by sifting and selecting among others available. It is a seminal document of Western Christianity and therefore of Western civilization. It directed the attention of the monk to the community, whose abbot was to have complete authority. The community's purpose was not merely to provide a hotbed for the cultivation or the salvation of individual souls, but that it should worship and live as a whole. The individual monk was to contribute to its task in the framework of an ordered routine of worship, prayer, and labor. From the individualism of traditional monasticism, a new human instrument was forged. It was to be one of the main weapons in the armory of church. Saint Benedict did not set his sights too high, and this was one secret of his success. The rule was within the powers of ordinary men who loved God, and his monks did not need to mutilate either body or spirit. Its success in estimating their need was demonstrated by its rapid spread. Very quickly, Benedictine monasteries appeared everywhere in the West. They became the key sources of missionaries and teaching for the conversion of pagan England and Germany. In the West, only the Celtic Church at its fringe clung to the older Eremitical model of monkish life. The Church's other new great support was the papacy. The prestige of St. Peter's See and the legendary guardianship of the apostles' bones always gave Rome a special place among the bishoprics of Christendom. It was the only one in the West to claim descent from one of the apostles. But in principle, it had little else to offer. The Western Church was a junior branch, and it was in the churches of Asia that the closest links with the apostolic age could be asserted. Something more was required for the papacy to begin its rise in the splendid preeminence which was taken for granted by the medieval world. To begin with, there was the city. Rome had been seen for centuries as the capital of the world, and for much of the world that had been true. Its bishops were the business colleagues of Senate and Emperor, and the departure of the imperial court only left their eminence more obvious. The arrival in Italy of alien civil servants from the Eastern Empire, whom the Italians disliked as much as they did the barbarians, directed new attention to the papacy as the focus of Italian loyalties. It was, too, a wealthy see, with an apparatus of government commensurate with its possessions. It generated administrative skill superior to anything to be found outside the imperial administration itself. This distinction stood out all the more clearly in times of trouble, when the barbarians lacked these skills. The See of Rome had the finest records of any. Already in the 5th century, papal apologists were exploiting them. The characteristically conservative papal stance, the argument that no new departures are being made but that old positions are being defended, is already present and was wholly sincere. Popes did not see themselves as conquerors of new ideological and legal ground, but as men desperately trying to keep the small foothold the Church had already won. This was the setting of the papacy's emergence as a great historical force. The 5th century, Leo the Great was the first pope under whom the new power of the Bishop of Rome was clearly visible. The emperor declared papal decisions to have the force of law, and Leo vigorously asserted the doctrine that the pope spoke in the name of Saint Peter. He assumed the title Pontifex Maximus, discarded by the emperors. It was believed that his intervention by visiting Attila had staved off the Hun attack on Italy. Bishops in the West who had hitherto resisted claims for Rome's primacy became more willing to accept them in a world turned upside down by barbarians. Still, though, Rome was a part of the state church of an empire whose religion Justinian saw as above all the emperor's concern. The Pope, in whom the future medieval papacy is most clearly revealed, was also the first Pope who had been a monk. In Gregory the Great, who reigned from 590 to 604, there thus came together the two great institutional innovations of the early Church. He was a statesman of great insight, a Roman aristocrat, loyal to the empire and respectful of the emperor. He was nevertheless the first pope who fully accepted the barbarian Europe in which he reigned. His Pontificate at last reveals a complete break with the classical world. He saw as his duty the first great missionary campaign, one of whose targets was pagan England, to which he sent Augustine of Canterbury in 596. He struggled against the Arian heresy and was delighted by the conversion of the Visigoths to Catholicism. He was as much concerned with the Germanic kings as with the emperor in whose name he claimed to act, but was also the doughtiest opponent of the Lombards. For help against them, he turned both to the emperor and, more significantly, the Franks. Yet the Lombards also made the Pope, of necessity, a political power. Not only did they cut him off from the imperial representative of Ravenna, but he had to negotiate with them when they stood before the walls of Rome. Like other bishops in the West, who inherited civilian authority, he had to feed his city and govern it. Slowly, Italians came to see the Pope as successor to Rome as well as to Saint Peter. In Gregory, the classical Roman heritage and the Christian are subsumed. He represented something new, though he can hardly have seen it like that. Christianity had been a part of classical heritage, yet it was now turning away from much of it and was distinct from it. Significantly, Gregory did not speak Greek, nor did he feel he needed to. There had already been signs of transformation in church's relations with the barbarians. With Gregory, one focus of his story has come at last to be Europe, not the Mediterranean basin. There were already sown in it the seeds of future, though not of the near future, for most of the world's population. The existence of Europe for the next 1,000 years or so is almost irrelevant, but a Europe is at last discernible, unimaginably different though it may be from what was to come and limited to the west of the continent. It was also decisively different from the past. The ordered, literate, unhurried life of Roman provinces had given way to a fragmented society with, encamped in it, a warrior aristocracy and their tribesmen, sometimes integrated with the earlier inhabitants, sometimes not. Their chiefs were called kings and were certainly no longer merely chiefs, any more than their followers. After nearly 2 centuries of involvement with what Rome had left behind, were mere barbarians. It was 550 that a barbarian king, a Goth, for the first time represented himself on his coins, decked in the imperial insignia. Through the impression wrought on their imaginations by the relics of a higher culture, through the efficacy of the idea of Rome itself, and through the conscious and unconscious work of the Church. Above all, these peoples were on their way to civilization, and their art remains to prove it. Of formal culture, they brought nothing with them to compare with antiquity. There was no barbarian contribution to the uncivilized intellect. Yet the cultural traffic was not all in one direction at less formal levels. The extent to which Christianity, or at least the church, was still an elastic form must not be underrated. Everywhere Christianity had to flow in the channels available, and these were defined by the layers of paganism, Germanic upon Roman upon Celtic. The conversion of a king like Clovis did not mean that his people made at once even a formal adherence to Christianity. Some were still pagan after generations had passed, as their graves showed. But this conservatism presented opportunities as well as obstacles. The church would utilize the belief in folk magic or the presence of a holy site which could associate a saint with respect for old age deities of countryside and forest. Miracles, knowledge of which was assiduously propagated in the saints' lives, read aloud to pilgrims to their shrines, were the persuasive arguments of the age. Men were used to the magical interventions of the old Celtic deities or manifestations of wooden power. For most men, then, as it has been for most of human history, the role of religion was not the provisional moral guidance or spiritual insight, but the propitiation of the unseen. Only over blood sacrifice did Christianity draw the line between itself and pagan past unambiguously. Much other pagan practice and reminiscence it simply christened. The process by which this came about has often been seen as one of the decline, and there are certainly reasonable arguments to be made to that effect. In material terms, Barbarian Europe was an economically poorer place than the empire of the Antonines. All over Europe, tourists gape still at the monuments of Rome's builders, as our barbarian predecessors must have done. Yet, out of this confusion, something quite new and immeasurably more creative than Rome would emerge in due course. It was perhaps impossible for contemporaries to view what was happening in anything but apocalyptic terms. But some may have seen just a little beyond this, as the concerns of Gregory suggest.